Hello and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to the complete NCERT series for international relations. Many UPSC aspirants, they often struggle with the subject of international relations. They think that international relations is just driven by current affairs and they find it difficult to track the ongoing developments. The reason why IR seems to be a difficult subject for you is because you may be lacking the historical background and the context to understand the current developments that are happening in today's world. That is exactly why we are launching this series, where we will cover the Class 12 textbooks that deal with political science and international relations, which will help lay the perfect foundation to help you understand some basic concepts and historical background with regard to international relations. In these classes, I promise to provide a comprehensive and detailed coverage of 8 important chapters. We have the Class 12 book on contemporary world politics, consisting of 7 important chapters, and Politics in India since Independence, again a Class 12 textbook, with one chapter focusing on India's external relations. So, if you study these 8 chapters in detail, along with the required conceptual understanding and the background, this will lay the perfect foundation for you to grasp international relations. And it makes it easier to understand the contemporary developments that are happening across the world today. So, let's start this journey today with us. And I just want you to ensure that you attend all the 16 classes that we have planned. I'm going to divide these 8 chapters, which I mentioned from 2 NCRT books, into these 16 sessions that you can see on your screen. We will talk about the Cold War period and understand the disintegration or the collapse of Soviet Union that brought the bipolar world to an end. We will talk about the implications of the end of Cold War era and how India navigated these difficult circumstances. We will also take a look at the foundational principles that guide India's foreign policy. We'll talk about Prime Minister Nehru's contribution and how India emerged in the post independent world, in the post colonial world, and how we have dealt with a chaotic neighborhood in South Asia. We will look at India's relations with our neighboring countries with special focus on China and Pakistan, particularly our border disputes and the conflicts that we have fought. We will also talk about India's nuclear policy and the emergence of alternate power centers post the collapse of Soviet Union, such as the European Union, ASEAN, the rise of China and Asian powers. What does it mean for Indian interests? We will also evaluate international organizations, including the United Nations, the need for UN reforms. We will talk about institutions such as World Bank, the IMF, and what is India's position on these international organizations. We will examine even security related issues, focusing on India's security challenges, specifically terrorism, and what is India's security strategy. We will also discuss India's environmental diplomacy with regard to climate change negotiations, and we will also be covering globalization, its impact on the society, on the global economy, and how India has been navigating these difficult moments. So these are the 16 classes that are lined up, starting from today, the 10th of August, till 31st August, from Monday to Friday, every day at 7 p.m. We will go live with these NCERT sessions. I just want you to ensure you mark your attendance, you stay with me for the 1.5 hour that we're going to discuss, because I'll be going beyond what is provided in the NCERT. I'll provide you a detailed coverage of the entire background and the concepts, and even those who have PSIR as their optional. These classes would be immensely beneficial. Now, to further help the aspirants, we will not just cover the topics given in the NCERT and go beyond the books. We will also be providing a free NCERT quiz and practice tests along with mains answer writing practice sessions. These free classes will be held as special classes on the Unacademy app. Please make a note, the free quiz and the practice test will take place every Thursday and Friday in the month of August. For example, on 13th and 14th August. Then again next week on 20th and 21st of August. And finally, the last week of our NCERT classes, 27th and 28th of August. At 3 p.m., 3 to 4 p.m., we will hold free special classes on the Unacademy app where I'll give you a lot of practice questions, MCQs, where you can attempt these questions and you can also get practice writing for your answers, for your mains answers, which I'm going to discuss in these sessions. Now, how can you enroll for the free special classes? The QR code is on your screen. You just have to scan the QR code and you will land on a page where these classes will be listed by tomorrow. So just ensure you scan the QR code. The link for the same is provided as well in the description box below. Today, you may not see the classes listed, but by tomorrow, those classes will be reflected. And this is where you can download your PDFs as well. The entire detailed PDF I'm providing here in this class, you can download it on the same page. So one single source where you can attend these special classes along with downloading the PDFs. Now, let's get started and look at what we're going to discuss today. Today, the main focus is on the Cold War period and the disintegration and collapse of Soviet Union. But to understand why Soviet Union collapsed, first you need some context. You need to know what is the Cold War. How did this geopolitical rivalry begin between the US-led power bloc and the Soviet Union-led power bloc? So once we look at those events in a chronological order, then we can lay the foundation to understand the Soviet model, the Soviet system, understand the weakness that was built into the political and economic system of the Soviet Union, which contributed to its disintegration and collapse. Now, this is very relevant for India because in tomorrow's session, we will talk about India's navigation of the global world order during the Cold War period, how India ensured it protected its interests in the rivalry between the Western and the Eastern Bloc. How did India navigate the world order after 91, after the collapse of the Soviet Union? That is something we'll cover in tomorrow's session, which is a continuation of today's topic. So, first, those of you who don't know what is the Cold War, right? Because there might be a lot of beginners who have just started out with their UPSC preparation or with studying international relations. The Cold War period lasted from 1945 to 1991. It was a period of intense geopolitical rivalry, diplomatic rivalry, and covert operations that was aimed at the Eastern Bloc countries by Western powers and vice versa. So the world was divided into two power blocks, one led by the democratic capitalist power bloc under the leadership of United States and the West European nations aligned with democracy and capitalism as their political and economic system, rivaled by the Eastern Bloc led by the USSR and its allies, its communist allies, built on the political and economic system of communism and socialism. So, this intense geopolitical ideological rivalry is what is referred to as the Cold War. Now, when you look at why this divide emerged, what were the circumstances in the post Second World War era that contributed to the emergence of the Cold War divide, we will look at some of the important policies of the United States, the economic policies primarily. We will look at the military alliances that were shaped in the 1940s, 1950s, that ended up dividing these major countries and their allies into two different segments that had a huge impact on the global geopolitical order itself. Now, when you look at the Second World War period in 1940s, the Nazis and the Axis powers that included Italy, Austria, Japan, and the others, all the fascist powers, they were defeated by the Allied powers led by US, UK, France, and their allies. What is interesting is that at that point, the Soviet Union was also one of the Allied powers. The Soviet Union played a very, very big role in working with the Western democratic powers to counter the fascist powers under Nazi Germany and the Axis powers. So, until that point, if these countries were aligned together to fight a common enemy, how come after 1945 they became arch rivals? Because during the Cold War, we not only saw a political and economic rivalry between the West and the East, we also saw intense targeting of each other through covert operations, through ensuring that their allies would be targeted. They would carry out sabotage operations to carry out regime change across the world. They got into an arms and space race, and they essentially triggered heightened tensions across the world. Now, this is primarily referred to as a Cold War. It was not a hot war because there was no direct conflict as such between US and USSR, right? But it largely remained as a diplomatic, economic, and a covert conflict that took place right below the threshold of a full fledged direct conflict between them. Now, this divide broke the world into two different power blocks, the Western and the Eastern power bloc. But there were other set of countries which championed a new ideology and laid the foundation for the third world. If the first world was led by the US and the Western powers, built on democratic capitalist principles, opposed to the second world, led by the Eastern Bloc countries under Soviet Union and its communist socialist allies. If they constituted the first and second world, a new set of countries, especially the newly independent nations who had opposed colonialism, imperialism, they championed the third world order and even laid the foundation for the NAM or the non aligned movement. This was led by India under Prime Minister Nehru, along with other like minded countries across Asia, Africa, and the Latin America region. The former colonies, which had fought for their freedom against colonial imperial powers, they aligned together to champion a new ideology, to not choose any sides between the Western and the Eastern blocs. And thus, in 1950s and 60s, we saw the world being divided on these three bases. We had the democratic aligned powers led by US, the West European powers on one side, USSR, and today's Central Asian republics, some of the East and Central European powers, extending their influence further into Cuba, Central America, and the South America region as well. Even across Africa, you would see those divisions emerging. Same with Asia, with few countries aligning with the Western Bloc, few aligning with the Communist Bloc, and few choosing to remain non aligned, like India, Indonesia, Yugoslavia, and the others. Now, it's very important to understand as to why these divisions came up in the first place. As I said, during Second World War, if Soviet Union was on the side of the Allied powers, fighting alongside US, UK, and France against a common enemy in the form of Nazi Germany and the fascist powers, how come they broke apart? How come that rivalry emerged between US and USSR? So there are many factors, many important events that we need to understand, and that is going to be the next part of my detailed discussion. Before I start this discussion, I have one very important announcement. As we are approaching the 80th Independence Day celebrations, Unacademy is not only being a part of this joyous occasion in joining the rest of the nation to celebrate the 80th Independence Day, but we are also offering a massive subscription offer for our students. As part of the Independence Day celebrations, there are at least 4 to 5 attractive offers being provided, which can be very, very useful for a beginner. As part of the celebrations, our subscription would now be available at just 16,999, which is one of our lowest price ever. Along with that, 80 students who are lucky enough, they would be getting a 100% refund on their subscription fee if they enroll within the offer period, within the Independence Day. The offer, I'm told, ends on 14th August. So 80 lucky students to mark the 80th Independence Day would be chosen through a lucky draw. They will get a 100% refund. And not just that, you'll also get a free extension. If you take a 15-month subscription, you'll get 3 month subscription free. For 18 months, you'll get 6 month free extension. For 24-month subscription, you get a 12-month free extension. And apart from that, you also get CSE Assure Guarantee. That is, for some reason, if you fail to clear the exam despite your best efforts, then your next attempt is entirely on us, absolutely free. And along with that, you also get a free access to Indian Express Current Affairs Edition, the UPSC Essentials Edition, that will give you access to premium articles of the Indian Express. As you know, Indian Express is one of the most reliable sources for current affairs. This will give you access to the premium section, the UPSC Essentials section, and the explained articles, which contain detailed information that is relevant for prelims and mains. And this will be part of your subscription. The Indian Express subscription alone will cost you around 1500, and that would be complimentary as part of the Independence Day offer. So if you wish to avail and enroll into our program, do it before the 14th of August. The link is provided below in the description. But to avail the discount and all these added offers, you have to enter the code IAS English. And also, to ensure that you get access to English medium classes, you need to enter the code IAS English so that you are given access just to the English medium classes. Now, coming back to our discussion, what were those events in 1940s and 50s that paved the way for the Cold War divide to emerge? See, first was the Potsdam Conference, held in Berlin in 1945 in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. So until then, we understood that USSR was fighting alongside the Western Allied powers against the Axis powers led by Nazi Germany. So in Berlin in 1945, at the Potsdam Conference, the leaders of US, UK, Soviet Union, and the other Allied powers met to discuss important issues to deal with the post Second World War scenario. The first main question was how to administer defeated Germany. As you know, Germany was demilitarized, and the question of administering this part of Europe came up. Essentially, Germany was carved up and divided into different zones where Britain gained some control, France gained some control, US also gained some control of Germany, and a large part of East Germany fell under Soviet control. To decide upon the immediate administration of defeated Germany and to carve out the territories, that's the main purpose behind the Potsdam Conference. Plus, there were other questions such as the demarcation of the boundary of Poland, Poland which had been occupied by Nazi Germany, right? Soviet Union demanded that a part of Polish territory be set aside as a buffer zone in order to protect Soviet security interests. But this demand of Soviet Union was rejected by US and the other West European powers. They refused to create a buffer zone in Eastern Europe as it would serve Soviet security interests. So this enraged the Soviet Union, creating a big divide between them. Then also the question of occupation of Austria and what exact role would Soviet Union play in Eastern Europe? Because Soviet Union, which at that point was already a major power in the Eurasia region, wanted to clearly exert its military and economic and political influence. It was very eager to promote the spread of communism and socialism. For example, under leaders like Lenin and then Stalin, the Communist Party in USSR had built a strong ideological foundation, and they were spreading this political economic model across Central Eastern Europe, and Soviet Union wanted to retain that influence. So the question of what exactly Soviet Union would do, what would be its role, what would be its influence, was something which was supposed to be addressed at the Potsdam Conference. So when Soviet Union demanded that a buffer zone be created around the Polish territory to ensure the security interests of Soviet Union was protected, the Western powers rejected the demand. And of course, the Soviet Union always had its doubts, its suspicion about America's nuclear weapons program. The American nuclear bombs, which had been dropped on Japan, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which had clearly established American supremacy and dominance, was something which unnerved the Soviets. They feared how US would use its nuclear arsenal to establish global dominance that could be detrimental to the interests of the communist powers. So the Soviets had their doubts, they had their suspicion. Within the Kremlin, there was a lot of mistrust with regard to Washington and America's actual interests in Europe and beyond. So these divisions, they came out very clearly in the open, in the public, at the Potsdam Conference. So Soviets were already unhappy that their demand for a security zone, a buffer zone, was not met. Then the question of occupation of Austria and the role of Soviet Union in Eastern Europe was not addressed. And the Americans were not being transparent with regard to their nuclear arsenal and their ambitions for the future. All of this led to a lot of mistrust between Kremlin and Washington. It led to the rise of tensions between them. And then came the Truman's Doctrine, a massive economic reconstruction plan championed by then US President Harry Truman in March 1947. Under this, Harry Truman started providing economic aid and assistance and even military assistance to several countries, including Greece and Turkey. And the main intention here was to curtail the further spread of communism and the communist ideology across Europe and Asia. So this was clearly aimed at containing the USSR, which the US at that point perceived as a main strategic threat. So given that the Truman Doctrine was aimed at curtailing USSR, this further enraged the Kremlin. It pushed Soviet Union to adopt more aggressive measures to create a collective bloc to oppose the Western democracies. So the Truman Doctrine played a very important role in this regard because followed up by the Truman Doctrine, there was an economic reconstruction plan championed by the then US Secretary of State, George Marshall, who unveiled the European Recovery Program to help the war ravaged European countries to rebuild themselves, to rebuild their infrastructure, to rehabilitate the refugees. US started playing a pivotal role and it launched the European Recovery Program, also referred to as the Marshall Plan, where US started offering massive economic aid. And through this route, US started pushing its own influence. It started gaining market influence. US companies started capitalizing on the reach that they had in Europe. So it was not just a political outreach or a diplomatic outreach, there was a clear economic intention as well. This was seen by many experts and historians as an extension of the Truman Doctrine itself. So Truman Doctrine, accompanied with Marshall Plan, started spreading American economic and capitalist influence. And if you know the base foundational ideology of communism and Marxism, it strongly opposes the capitalist model. It opposes any private enterprise. It is built on the foundation that the state controls everything, the state delivers and provides for everything. So this ran counter to the beliefs of communism and socialism. And Soviet Union perceived the Marshall Plan as a direct economic threat. It perceived the Truman Doctrine as a direct economic threat. So the suspicion started growing further. So now in Soviet Union, the Communist Party came out with the Communist Information Bureau, or the Cominform, in 1947 as a direct counter to the Marshall Plan, under which the Soviet Union started collectively organizing the communist states in Eastern Europe and the Eurasia region. Take, for example, the Baltic states, for example, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or even Ukraine, and even Central Asian republics that you have today. They were all pushed by the Kremlin to come together, form a collective organization rooted in a common economic and political philosophy and ideology. And under the common form, the Soviet Union rejected the dollar based push that the US was giving for the global economy. It rejected the American aid and assistance that was flowing into Europe and other parts of the world. Even the newly independent nations in Africa and Asia started receiving massive aid and assistance from the US as part of its economic influence operations. So this was seen as a direct threat to Soviet influence and the very presence of communism and socialism in the Eurasia region. So, as you can see, by 1947, the divisions were already emerging, and this was very, very evident in Europe. By 1948, we saw the emergence of a clear divide, a barrier in Europe, popularly referred to as the Iron Curtain. It was a political, economic, and military barrier, which was even physically erected on the ground to basically divide Europe into two parts, with West Europe under democratic capitalist influence aligned with US and UK and France, and the eastern parts, including a few central parts of Europe, from Poland to today's Ukraine, clearly aligning with the Soviet communist bloc. Now, look at the map here, which clearly depicts that Iron Curtain. You can see how Europe came to be divided on ideological lines. You can see how Germany itself was broken up. As I said, after the Potsdam Conference, Germany was not only carved up between four nations, between US, UK, France, and Soviet Union, but even the capital Berlin was divided, and a barbed wire and a fence and a wall was erected to formally divide Berlin and large parts of Germany. So this military, political, economic divide extended across Central Europe, with few countries choosing to remain non aligned or neutral. Countries like Austria, Switzerland, even Finland and Sweden to some extent, choosing to remain non aligned, choosing to remain neutral in this context. Though they wouldn't join the non aligned movement led by India, they opted their own form of neutrality, not to side with either the American Western Bloc or with the Communist Eastern Bloc, fearing that they would be pressurized by both the sides. But as you can see, Europe was essentially bifurcated through the Iron Curtain. And you can see how Germany was carved up, with French, British, and American sectors coming up in the West, which was more aligned with democratic capitalist influence, with the eastern part of Germany falling completely under Soviet control, and the emergence of a communist regime in East Germany. So, this division was essentially formalized with the Berlin blockade of 1948. So these years were very crucial in the emergence of the Cold War divisions and rivalry. From 1945 to 1948, there were a series of events: the Potsdam Conference, the Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, and the Soviet response to it, and the Iron Curtain, which came up, formalized with the Berlin blockade that basically divided Berlin and Germany. Soviet Union's response was to isolate, cut off the communist world, limit its contact with the Western world, to prevent the migration of people between communist states and the Western states, to prevent their exposure to American democracy or Western civilizational and cultural values. So a clear attempt was made to divide up Europe, to stem the mass emigration that would probably bring even the people in the communist areas under democratic influence. So this led to very severe restrictions on cross border movement, where people who attempted to flee the eastern parts into the west would often be shot by Soviet guards or by the communist East Germany security forces. And there was active intelligence presence by Britain, by US, by Soviet Union, engaging in covert intelligence, covert operations against each other, trying to subvert and sabotage the other side. So this period saw heightened covert activity between their intelligence agencies. The KGB became extremely proactive to target the American and Western interests. Same with CIA and MI6 from US and Britain, being very active in the Eastern Bloc in Soviet Union as well to target the communist powers and to destabilize them internally. So this eventually led to the emergence of a military alliance that took shape on both the sides. By 1948, the Brussels Defense Treaty had been firmed up because the West European powers were not prepared for the Berlin blockade and the Iron Curtain which the Soviet Union had placed across Central Europe. This isolation of Eastern Europe and the militarization of the communist states created a direct threat to Western democratic powers in West Europe. So they started aligning together under the Brussels Defense Treaty in 1948, which basically laid the foundation for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Through the Washington Treaty signed in 1949 that built upon the Atlantic Charter of the 1940s, it brought the transatlantic powers together, the like-minded Western democracies together under a formal military alliance with US, UK, and others joining this alliance and establishing the principle of collective defense under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty or the Washington Treaty. They promised to treat any aggression against a NATO member as an act of aggression against their own state and committed to organize collective defense to come to the support of the other NATO member which was being attacked by a non NATO aggressor. So the formation of this military club further heightened the concerns for Kremlin and the Soviet bloc. This pushed Soviet Union and the communist states to align together, form their own counter-military alliance in 1950s. In 1955, the Warsaw Pact was created. The USSR with seven major Eastern European nations that included Poland and the other Soviet republics came together to establish the Warsaw Pact as a counter-military alliance. Then we also had the Britain-led military organizations focusing on Central Europe and the West Asia region, where democracies were extending their influence on one side, with communist powers extending their own influence on the other side. So, Britain and France were very proactive in this regard, be it in the Balkan region or be it in the North Africa and the West Asia region. So, this divide and conflict started spreading. So it was not a overt, direct military confrontation. It was more of a covert involvement, a covert interference in each other's affairs, uh, political, economic, and diplomatic blockades, and a push towards extending their own influence to retain their interest, to retain their influence in different target countries. Take, for example, how the Soviets started pushing communism and socialism towards the Americas region, for example, in Cuba or in Latin America region, right? Across several Latin American countries, from Chile to Venezuela to Brazil, or how US started pushing democracy and socialism, right? In the name of protecting civil liberties, in the name of protecting human rights. US would actively interfere in several authoritarian regimes in countries across Africa, West Asia, and South Asia as well. And we would see this covert game being played out in South Asia as well, including in the Indian subcontinent. The 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War being a classic example of the Cold War divide, how US sided with Pakistan, ended up not only giving diplomatic support for Pakistan's genocide against Bengalis, but even actively threatened India, issued open threats to India during the 1971 war, even mobilized the US Navy to intimidate the then Indira Gandhi government, which finally pushed India to abandon its non-alignment and align with the Soviet Union with the historic Treaty of Peace and Friendship signed in 1971-72 that brought India clearly under the Soviet influence post 1970. So this period saw intense and heightened arms race and space race between these powers as well, primarily in the nuclear domain. As US had already established its nuclear dominance, the Soviet Union, which felt insecure, which felt threatened, it started accelerating its nuclear weapons program and conducted hundreds of nuclear tests, which was matched by the United States with counter tests across the world. They started amassing a massive amount of nuclear warheads and delivery systems. The world reached a point where both US and USSR had accumulated thousands of warheads with advanced delivery systems, from intercontinental ballistic missiles to strategic bombers to even nuclear powered submarines, constantly tracking each other, constantly threatening each other. And there were few moments where they reached the brink of a nuclear conflict. For example, the Cuban Missile Crisis, or how the Soviet naval fleet shadowed the American naval fleet in Indian Ocean and Bay of Bengal during 1971. These were some moments during Cold War where the two power blocs came quite close to a direct military confrontation with possible nuclear exchange. This also triggered a parallel space race from 1950s itself, as Soviet Union launched Sputnik and started placing astronauts in orbit. The United States took this up as a matter of national pride and accelerated its space program under NASA, launching satellites into orbit, placing humans in orbit, eventually racing to the moon, and the lunar landing becoming a moment of national pride during the Cold War era. So this intense arms and space race, it led to greater militarization. They diverted a large quantity of their resources, their capabilities towards their nuclear weapons program, their military modernization, and their space race. This led to tremendous technological developments, a big technological leap. At the same time, it created further divisions, increased the tensions and the suspicion, adding to the trouble between the two blocs. So by 1970s, we were staring at a proper scenario where it was a potential state where a bigger conflict could have erupted. There were many moments, as I said, where the two blocs came very close to a direct military confrontation with possible nuclear consequences. Take, for example, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Then Cuban leader Fidel Castro had firmly aligned with the communist bloc, with Soviet Union, and the United States was looking to carry out a regime change. It even pushed for a military invasion known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, which ended up being a failed American military operation. The CIA tried multiple times to topple Fidel Castro's regime, and eventually this led Soviet Union to directly step in. And Soviet Union not only armed Cuba, but reportedly it started positioning its nuclear assets in Cuba. And from Cuba, the US mainland is just a short distance away. So if Soviet nuclear launches and warheads and ICBMs were being placed in Cuba, this would pose a direct threat to continental US. And as a result, the United States imposed a naval blockade around Cuba, leading to a direct naval standoff between US and Soviet Navy. Fortunately, the situation was diffused at the last minute through diplomatic intervention, but one miscalculation could have easily escalated the tensions and could have easily pushed the world towards the brink of a nuclear conflict between two major nuclear armed rivals. So you can see how the divided world was extremely hazardous, where countries would not hold back. Countries would go to any extent to protect their interests. Take, for example, how Western civilizational values, political values, economic system, cultural values were pushed through influence operations. How the CIA cultivated the Hollywood to push the American influence, to project the Soviets and communists as the evil guy, and how the Soviets tried countering this by trying to influence media across the world. There were many instances of KGB funding media outlets in India as well to promote communist ideology and to put down democratic and capitalist ideology. And the same from the other side as well, with CIA, MI6 running similar operations across the world, essentially to shape global influence and create a narrative that would suit their respective interests. But as you know, the Western influence operations always had an upper hand, given the more sophisticated technological developments in the West and the economic expansion of the West, primarily led by US, gave them the required reach, gave them the required influence and resources to build up a stronger narrative in favor of democracies and capitalist model, and even to put down the Soviet model. So this covert activity extended into active intelligence operations, where both sides were involved in targeting each other or toppling regimes that aligned with the other side. Take, for example, how Iran's regime was toppled in 1950s, in 1953, under Operation Ajax. The Iranian coup against the then popularly elected leader who was trying to take a nationalistic stand, more inclined to align either with the non-aligned bloc or maybe with the Soviet bloc, was brought down with a CIA-sponsored coup, and US installed a puppet regime in the form of the Shah, the Iranian Shah, which is at the very root of today's US-Iran conflict. Right until 1979, until the Iranian Revolution, Iran remained a puppet state of the US, following this regime change operation led by the US intelligence. Or take, for example, the American involvement in Latin America, right? Not just Cuba, even in Central America, in South America. Multiple regimes were toppled, even if they showed slightest inclination to align with the Soviet bloc or the communist bloc, or even if they went against capitalist interests of the US corporate giants. Guatemala being one of the best example. The American Fruit Company, right, which had essentially colonized Guatemala for banana plantations. It worked with the CIA to topple Guatemala's nationalist leader, and that's that's where the term banana republic got popularized following Operation PB success, where the CIA worked with the American corporate interests to ensure that the United Fruit Company has control over the banana plantation, the land in Guatemala, which was seen as crucial for American capitalist interests. So you see the convergence of state interests, geopolitical interests with economic interests and corporate interests. So capitalist America had that economic weight to push its influence, even if through regime change operations, even if through toppling popular leaders, elected leaders as well. Or look at the covert involvement of both the power blocs in Afghanistan, right? By 1970s, Afghanistan remained firmly under communist influence. Soviet Union, which shared direct borders with Afghanistan, had managed to protect its interests by installing a pro-communist regime. But as it felt threatened with growing American influence, Soviet Union carried out a disastrous invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. Following this, it enraged the native Pashtuns in the southern eastern parts of Afghanistan, sharing borders with Pakistan, who launched a Mujahideen war against the occupying Soviet forces. And the Americans capitalized on this opportunity. They got directly involved in this conflict by working with Pakistan and other like minded powers such as Saudi Arabia, and sponsored a covert proxy war against the occupying Soviet forces. The CIA worked with Pakistan's ISI and funded the creation of the Afghan Mujahideen by further radicalizing the Pashtuns by training them, arming them. The Saudis also had their own interests to oppose the USSR. By 1970s, US and Saudi Arabia had aligned closely together after the oil shock, the oil crisis of the 1970s. So we saw the creation of Afghan Mujahideen as a covert operation of US, Pakistan, and its allies to mainly target the occupying Soviet forces, which drained the Soviet Union in this unnecessary conflict. Very similar to the Ukraine war, how Russia has now invaded Ukraine mainly to protect its influence and prevent the further spread of Western influence. A very similar development took place in Afghanistan in 1970s and 80s. This conflict dragged till 1989, and eventually the Mujahideen managed to drain the Russian forces, Soviet forces. By 1989, Soviet Union finally retreated. By then, this war had drained the Soviet economy. It had become one of the major factors which eventually contributed to the complete disintegration and collapse of the USSR. Of course, there were many other political, economic factors, but the war in Afghanistan and the defeat in Afghanistan of Soviet Union is considered as one of the key factors which accelerated the fall of communist Soviet Union. So now the big question is, what were those weaknesses in the Soviet system that led to its collapse? Understanding this is very critical because, see, the Soviet Union has been a great friend, an all weather friend of India. Its successor state, Russia, remains an all weather friend of India. Though India had chosen non alignment from, I would say, 1947 till 1971, though NAM was founded much later, we were very clear from the beginning, that is, after the Second World War, that India would not choose sides between these emerging rivalries. India championed a new ideology. India ensured that some form of stability was maintained. Though third world is a derogatory term today, referring to poor countries, underdeveloped countries, the third world basically provided some sense of stability in a chaotic world that was divided by these major superpowers, right? Tell me if you agree with this or not. India played this critical role with Egypt, with Yugoslavia, Ghana, Indonesia, many other countries from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. They ensured that they didn't add to the fuel which was already present, the fire which was already burning, right? Without the non aligned movement, probably there would have been more chances of a direct military confrontation between two nuclear armed superpowers. And that remains one of India's key contribution to maintaining global stability, global peace after its independence. Now, understanding the Soviet system, the political model, the economic system is very, very critical to know why Soviet Union collapsed. Imagine the second biggest power at that point. How could it simply fall apart? How could it simply collapse? This offers key lessons for every major power today, including India. If you don't treat and handle your internal differences, your internal political inconsistencies, your internal economic failures, if these issues are not addressed, any major power could meet the fate of the Soviet Union. That is why this lesson becomes all the more important. Now, when you look at Soviet Union, its origin goes back to the famous Bolshevik Revolution, the socialist revolution led by Vladimir Lenin, the founder of the Bolshevik Communist Party, where communism took root and built upon the ideas of Karl Marx, built upon the existing social divides between the poor and the rich, between the proletariat and the bourgeois. So the Bolsheviks, who toppled the Russian regime, right, the Russian Tsarist Empire and the oligarchs, they managed to bring together the masses, the disgruntled workers, the farmers, the peasants, the landless, and they built the ideology of an egalitarian society, an equal society, where the state would be in supreme control, where the party, the Communist Party, would exercise supreme control. The communist model is built on the rule of one party. No elections, no democracy, no basic rights, no liberties. The party cannot be questioned, but the party is deemed to know everything. The party is deemed to work for the good of the people, for the good of the masses. So it not only opposed the capitalist model of economy, where there seemed to be a unfair division of wealth, a massive concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, right? And Karl Marx's ideology was again a critique of the failures of capitalism, its inequality, its inherent flaws. And Lenin built upon that. And following the Bolshevik Revolution, brought together the Soviet republics, including today's Belarus, Ukraine, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, today's Central Asian countries that you have, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and the others. All these countries which were under communist influence were brought together to form the Soviet Union. And it played a critical role, as I said, during the Second World War. Under Joseph Stalin, Communist Party rose to further height. It was not only known for its authoritarian rule, where Stalin committed brutal atrocities against any criticism, any dissent, purging lakhs and millions of people, but he managed to navigate the Soviet Union during the difficult era of the Second World War. During the fight against Nazi Germany, Soviets played a critical role in halting the advance of the Nazis beyond Poland towards Russia and played a key role in putting a brake on the further spread of fascism towards Eastern Europe. So it was this role of Soviet Union, right, which makes it quite interesting because they did work on the same side as the Allied powers. They were partners at one point, right, before 1945. But as we discussed, developments that emerged after 1945, a bipolar world which had emerged after the defeat of Italy, Japan, and Germany, led to these rivalries and divisions getting cemented on both sides. Soviet Union feared America's nuclear arsenal. It doubted American intentions. It had its suspicion about American programs such as Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and US had its reservations about communist socialist ideology and the spread of communist socialist influence because this is an ideology that had a mass appeal. It is something that appealed to the masses given its egalitarian values that it was built upon. Now, when you look at communism as a political model, socialism as an economic model, there is an element of influence that even India has drawn from these principles and from the Soviet Republic itself. Take, for example, our constitution makers, post 1947, drew inspiration from the Soviet constitution and the Soviet model. Take, for example, the fundamental duties in the Indian Constitution, directly derived from the Soviet Constitution. Or look at the 5 year planned model of development that inspired Jawaharlal Nehru, introduce the 5 year plans and to set up the planning commission, very similar to the centralized planning that you get to see in communist states such as USSR or even in China for that matter, right? Or look at the mixed economic model that we adopted post independence, right? Where a mix of socialism with some traits of capitalism was adopted, right? So that again shows the appeal of the ideologies, especially in newly independent nations, or especially in poor countries which had been exploited by colonial imperial powers. There was a natural appeal towards communism and socialism. That explains why the Western powers saw this as a threat to their democratic capitalist model, why American corporate giants saw this as a threat to their business interests, why there was a collusion between the state apparatus and the corporate interests in the US and in the West, where they work together to counter the spread of communism, to protect their reach, to protect their markets, to protect their investments. So, in communism and socialism, though the philosophy is built on equality, the state uh, abolishing private property, right, with no concept of individual property ownership, with the state owning the land and the resources, the state working towards distribution of wealth, preventing concentration of wealth, the state providing for all required necessary goods, the state producing all those goods that are required in the economy, the state deciding upon the entire economic model from imports to exports to what to be produced, how much to be produced, a license based production system, a tightly controlled quota based economic model is what you get to see in the socialist economic model built on the communist political model. But of course, it sounds great on paper. Theoretically, it sounds like a great ideology compared to the widespread divisions that you see in a capitalist model. But of course, socialist communist model has almost failed in every part of the world, including in the Soviet Union. See, the communist socialist model that does not provide for individual rights, that doesn't recognize liberty and the value of criticism, the value of dissent and diversity, it essentially creates an internal incongruence. Now, when you see how Soviet Union rose as a major power after Second World War, it did become one of the most important powers at that point, right? After the United States, USSR was clearly the most dominant economic and military power at that point. The USSR invested heavily in militarization. It caught up with the nuclear race. It even marched ahead of the US with regard to its nuclear arsenal. It made major advancements in space technology. But however, Soviet technology was always steps behind, generations behind compared to Western technology. See, with regard to resources, USSR was blessed from oil to mineral ores to metallurgical industries, from iron and steel to massive manufacturing capability at that point. USSR had everything. It had the right resources, it had the talent, the manpower, and it had the intent and the capability. But still, the Soviet Union's collapse is a big, it's a big paradox, right? It's a big irony. And to understand that, you need to see how this communist socialist model started failing within. It's not just external interference, it's not just the covert sabotage and suppression by Western powers. This system collapsed because of its own internal paradox and internal inconsistencies that existed. Under the USSR, there was a centralized control that was being exercised, where the party was supreme and the general secretary of the Communist Party was seen as the supreme leader, providing for a dictatorship, a one man rule, where the leader cannot be questioned, the party itself cannot be criticized or questioned. No scope for elections, no scope for democratic dissent. So, bringing together so many republics with different ethnic, religious profile, with different economic priorities, with different nationalistic identities, and uniting them under one centralized leadership in itself was a recipe for disaster. Because if you don't allow for local aspirations to be met, if you don't give any space to vent out the local anger and resentment, if you don't provide for local autonomy and implement a enforced, strict, hierarchical, centralized leadership, this obviously becomes a recipe for dissent. Because especially in the eastern parts of Soviet Union, right, there was a very quick influence of the West that started growing. If you look at Poland being a classic example, right? Or the entire Central and Eastern Europe, right next to the Iron Curtain, there was a very quick spread of the Western influence, be it the Western way of life, the faster advances that Western economies were making. It started appealing to the people. Eventually, by 1980s, the Soviet economic model was falling apart. People were facing massive shortage of consumer goods, shortage of food. They started depending on food supplies and food imports. The heavy subsidized model of their industrial manufacturing, it had taken a hit. It had only given rise to red tapeism, where corrupt communist bureaucrats were colluding with Russian oligarchs and enriching themselves. So few party leaders, party bureaucrats, and oligarchs were enriching themselves, with the masses being left behind. So naturally, the discontent started growing, it started rising up. And whatever wealth and resources were there, it was all being channeled towards militarization. Because in the Warsaw Pact, right, if you take out the seven Eastern European countries which were part of the alliance, it was primarily the USSR which was leading and backing this military alliance. That was never the case with NATO. Though US plays a dominant role, European countries were also contributing. Whereas in Warsaw Pact, it was USSR which was doing the heavy lifting, almost the entire heavy lifting. And the USSR was incurring massive expenditure on maintaining its military outposts, its military bases, its massive investments in its nuclear program and space program. These inherent flaws within the Soviet system led to its eventual collapse, along with other external factors as well. The bureaucratic delays, the slow decision making, the corrupt system which they had developed, right? Eventually, this was bound to result in corrupt nexus between the party leaders and officials and the oligarchs who controlled some of the manufacturing industries. So, this led to a situation where basic essentials were not being supplied, from even milk to bread to essential food grains and cereals to meat. Everything was in shortage. Supermarkets were running dry. It reached a point where cities were struggling to survive with lack of electricity, lack of water, lack of housing, unemployment. Even education and healthcare was struggling. So the failure to build basic infrastructure, the failure to focus on basic governance, administration, to address the political aspirations of the people in different parts of the Soviet Republic, essentially became the root cause for the collapse of the Soviet Union. The system was built to fail, right? If you look at how this system is structured, as I explained, right, the very foundational ideology of communism, socialism is built to lead to these developments. The absence of any freedom of speech, freedom of expression, the lack of accepting any dissent, lack of any democratic rights. It's a clear recipe for increasing the frustration and resentment amongst the masses. So especially towards Central Eastern Europe, right, and the peripheries of the Soviet Union, right, those who had more exposure towards the West, those who were now realizing by 1980s that their whole ideology was a farce. They'd been lied throughout their lives through Soviet propaganda. That Western citizens were leading a much better life technologically. Right, Soviet Union had fallen behind. Economically, it had fallen behind. Even its military technology started getting outdated. That's one reason why India would face severe issues with Soviet imported arms and weapons later on in the 1990s and early 2000s, as our military modernization was largely based on Soviet supplies. We were essentially procuring slightly outdated technology, though it served its purpose at a certain point in time. Eventually, India had to deal with the expensive repairs, the repeated failures and crashes of Soviet built systems, highlighting the technological gap between the East and the West, the tight control over every institution, and the lack of complete accountability. No accountability at all amongst party leaders, party officials, and wealth was being concentrated, right? There were few who were enriching themselves. This is what communism had opposed. This is what the ideology of Lenin, Stalin, or Karl Marx was built upon. But communism and socialism in Soviet Union was contradicting itself. These internal inconsistencies is what added to the pressure that was building up. Now, when you take the USSR, there were nearly 15 republics that were part of it. Right? Today, they've broken up into multiple countries, including Russia, Ukraine, Central Asian countries, the Baltic states, and the others. Out of these Soviet republics, Russia was always dominant. Russia was the most dominant bloc within the Soviet Union. So this had created dissent, resentment in Ukraine, in Belarus, and in the Baltic region. primarily towards the European periphery, the nationalist sentiments were being suppressed. See, many experts expected that discontent would grow in ethnically and religiously diverse regions like Central Asia. If you look at today's Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, for example, this is where it was expected that initial resentment would come up. But that was not the case. In fact, Central Asian republics that you have today, they were very happy being part of Soviet Union. Even in 1991, when USSR failed, the Central Asian countries were still willing to be a part of the Soviet Republic. It was primarily the well-off regions in Eastern Europe, right? They were the ones to initially break away, especially Ukraine and the other regions, including the Baltic states. They raised the banner of dissent and they realized that they would be better off on their own. Because, see, on one side, Russia was completely dominating the Soviet Union. A few officials, a few leaders in the Kremlin, they were controlling the resources, they were enriching themselves. There was no scope for any alternate views and opinions. The Afghan war had become a costly mistake, as I told you, right? Thousands of Russian soldiers, Soviet soldiers, were being slaughtered in the Afghan battlefield. And US was clearly gaining an upper hand through its covert war by sponsoring the Afghan Mujahideen. This was draining the US military on one side. And gradually and slowly, communism started losing its appeal. By 1980s itself, communism became widely unpopular. So one by one, from Central Eastern Europe, countries started moving away from communism. Even countries like Poland made a big shift towards democracy. Across the Central East Europe belt, right? On the other side of the Iron Curtain, countries started shifting away from communism, following popular revolts, uprisings, rebellions, eventually paving the path for democracy and the further spread of Western influence. In 1990s, after USSR fell, we saw how rapidly the European Union and NATO built up their influence by spreading their membership, by adding countries of Central Eastern Europe into their fold. And that again highlights the weakness of the communist socialist model that Soviet Union had built. The arms race and space race had drained their wealth and resources. They could never catch up with US and Western bloc. Technologically, they were falling behind. And Soviet infrastructure was infamous for being inefficient. Their public transport was inefficient. Basic public services were largely missing. As I said, health and education was collapsing. Unemployment was massive. With regard to their banking system as well, right? Soviet banks, they started failing, especially by late 80s. They were dealing with a massive debt burden, rising uh, non-performing assets. The industries which had borrowed heavily, they were failing. And the people on the ground, they were facing a shortage of almost every essential goods and item. From basic medicines to food items, everything was in shortage. So year by year, the resentment, the anger kept growing, and the centralized leadership failed to address this crisis that was brewing across the Soviet Union. So eventually, the inevitable had to happen, right? As countries in Eastern Europe started swinging towards democracy, abandoning communism, revolting and rebelling against it. Eventually, the Iron Curtain started being lifted. It started falling apart. The collapse of the Berlin Wall, the bringing down of the Berlin Wall, was one of the most pivotal moments in 1989, where Germany reunified. The reunification of Germany following the breakdown of the Berlin Wall was a symbolic moment, critical moment that essentially symbolized the failure of the communist socialist model and explained everything that was wrong about the Soviet model. Right? People in East Germany, they were desperate to get out. They were desperate to escape the authoritarian regime, the constant state surveillance, the atrocities that their intelligence services were perpetrating. So this became one of the main factors that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall, lifting of the Iron Curtain. And the reunification of Germany started and accelerated this entire process. One by one, the country started shifting towards democracy. Then within the USSR, starting with Mikhail Gorbachev, his policies he aimed to reform at the last minute. He tried to introduce some last minute changes to prevent the eventual crisis from unfolding. Because Mikhail Gorbachev is someone who understood at least the root causes that were contributing to this crisis within the Soviet republics. He started normalizing ties with the West. He reached out to Western powers, trying to build a, a peaceful relationship, trying to build a harmonious engagement with the West. He pushed for major political economic reforms within the Soviet Republic. He understood, he gauged the public opinion, he understood that across the USSR, there was a lot of anger and resentment. So he introduced two major policies: the Glasnost, also referred to as the openness, and the Perestroika. Glasnost referred to political reforms aimed at decentralizing power, introducing greater liberty, providing for more political liberties and democratic rights. Whereas Perestroika referred to market reforms, market linked reforms, to push for economic changes, to reduce the state control. But these reforms came a little too late. It was too slow to be implemented. Those who wanted the change, they were not happy with it. They were disappointed. They were disappointed with Mikhail Gorbachev that his Glasnost and Perestroika policies were too slow and it came too late. But the hardliners, the extremist factions within the Communist Party, they were against it. They were opposed to any of these changes. They took a completely opposing stand that such changes will further weaken the state, weaken the party. And that is exactly what happened. So these last minute reforms pushed by Gorbachev had absolutely no positive impact. In fact, many historians believe that Glasnost and Perestroika, it actually accelerated the fall of the Soviet Union because now it gave more flexibility for the pro-democracy forces, especially the regions which were looking to break away, like Ukraine, for example, right? Or Georgia, for example, which were under more European and Western influence, who were keen to break away from the stranglehold of the USSR. They used this to step up the protests, the demonstrations. And Gorbachev went slow and he didn't use coercive force against the protesters. Because otherwise, Soviet Union was known to be a repressive regime, striking down on any form of dissent and criticism. But Gorbachev did not resort to that. But his mixture of policies, it did not please the pro-democracy forces. It didn't please the pro-European Western forces. It did not please the extremist communist factions as well. Eventually, across Soviet Union, it contributed to more chaos, more unrest, and a eventual throwover and toppling of the entire regime. Now, when you look at the policies of Gorbachev and how it failed to arrest the sentiments that was spreading across, right? It's a clear lesson in how administration should be handled. It again, it's a clear sign that authoritarian regimes are often built to fail. It's a clear sign that the extremist communist socialist model is also built to fail. It's not that capitalism is perfect. It's not that democracy is perfect. But communism, socialism has too much of internal contradictions that was very clearly exposed in the Soviet Union. So that again answers our question. Like, how did this powerful nation collapse? Within a few years, it fell apart, completely disintegrating into multiple nations. The answer is very simple. As I said, the political economic reforms were too late and it was too little. Probably if this had started in 60s and 70s, maybe the story would be different. If Soviet Union had focused more on its internal capabilities, if it had genuinely addressed political aspirations of the people in different parts of the USSR, probably the story would have been different, right? That would have been some alternate history. But now, when you look at the developments that happened in late 80s and early 90s, it was very clear that Gorbachev's policies it was too late and too little. So that's where a very famous Russian leader emerged, Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin managed to win a popular election in Russia, right? There was a coup which was attempted by the hardline communist factions. They wanted to topple the regime and ensure that the Communist Party and the state was protected. They were met with the pro democracy forces with counter protests. So, as complete chaos was engulfing the USSR, Boris Yeltsin won a popular election and he started opposing the centralized control of the USSR. Now, he aligned with the other Soviet republics like Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, and they declared their independence and stated that the USSR had now been disbanded. This collective union of the communist blocs, which had formed the USSR, it came apart in 1991 with Yeltsin aligning with Ukraine and the other countries, the other republics that were there towards Eastern Europe, breaking apart and calling for the complete disbandment of the USSR. The Baltic states declared their independence. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, right? Ukraine, Russia. Russia would emerge as a successor state to the USSR. But as I said, what is really interesting is that the Central Asian republics, which were ethnically, religiously diverse and more backward, they were actually happy being part of Soviet Union. It was the more richer and well-off regions like Ukraine, which actually wanted to break away from USSR. That in itself is a very important lesson. How mismanaged economy, centralized state control, authoritarian leadership, lack of democratic rights, how it can bring down even the most powerful of states. So when you finally summarize everything, right? And try to understand why Soviet Union disintegrated. Probably there are few reasons that you can list out. One is, of course, the Cold War rivalry itself. The Cold War rivalry, which locked Soviet Union into a race with the West, with the United States. Now, this was a race that Soviets were never equipped to deal with, right? Though they made their advances, they could never outcompete the West with regard to its technology and economic might, and even in terms of its military superiority. The second main reason was the drain on wealth and resources towards militarization, the massive expenditure on militarization, the obsession with expanding the nuclear arsenal, the obsession with covert intelligence operations at any cost, right? The KGB was super active across the world. Despite the failing state, KGB remained very, very active in almost every country, countering the West and destabilizing any pro West regimes. So, the massive drain on wealth and resources towards militarization destroyed its focus on economic investments and reforms. The collapse of its economic model, the massive shortages, the lack of essential public services, of course, played a very, very important role. The shortage of food, the reliance on imports, the failure of the subsidized model, right? The massive corruption within the state, the nexus between the party leaders, the bureaucrats, and few oligarchs who enriched themselves, who were much better off than the common people. It further increased the resentment, the divisions, and the failure to meet the political aspirations across regions. The lack of democratic rights, the disrespect towards any dissent, the attempt to crush any criticism and dissent, the lack of liberties, the failure to fulfill the genuine political aspirations of people of different identities. Very strong nationalistic sentiments had already started spreading across parts of Ukraine, across the East European countries, which were part of the Warsaw Pact. But Soviet Union never addressed these genuine grievances that were coming up, right? And every time there were protests, it would be crushed. It would be labeled as a Western attempt. It would be labeled as a Western intelligence efforts to subvert the USSR. So deflecting the blame and just focusing on further policing and militarization played a very big role in pushing the Soviet Union towards its own final collapse. So today, the USSR has now broken up into multiple nations that you see across the Eurasia region. So, be it the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or the East European nations, Belarus, Ukraine, and towards Eurasia, you have Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and of course the Central Asian countries. Eventually, they all split apart, declared their own independence, and Russia, that emerged as the successor state, inheriting much of Soviet Union resources and wealth and influence, continued to dominate this region and continues till date to dominate this region. And this, in a way, explains Russia's obsession today under Putin to try and rebuild the Soviet glory, the glory days of the Soviet Union. Putin is surrounded by a group of advisors in the Kremlin, right, who believe that the USSR can be revived in some form or the other. That's the obsession with regard to bringing Ukraine under Russian fold. Because see, Belarus and Kazakhstan, they remain under close Russian influence. But the others, like Ukraine, Baltic states have gone on to join both European Union and NATO, right? Former Soviet republics joining EU and NATO was seen as a major blow for Russian influence in the 1990s and early 2000s. Then even Poland, right, and other countries in Eastern Europe, which previously were aligned with the Warsaw Pact, shifting towards EU and NATO, came as a big blow. So one development that Russia could not tolerate in the last 2 decades was Ukraine swinging towards the West. Ukraine seeking more democratic reforms. Ukraine pushing itself towards a membership of EU and NATO is something that Russia could not stand. Because see, under Soviet Union, Ukraine was one of the key constituents because Ukraine was of agricultural basket. Even today, Ukraine is a major food producer, right? And it's also home to some important industries, from iron, steel to technological military industries, nuclear power plants of the Soviet era. So, with regard to Soviet power projection and Soviet economic influence, Ukraine was always a key constituent. And that explains Russia's current obsession, Putin's current obsession with Ukraine, right? The lack of respect towards Ukrainian nationalistic identity, the will to impose Russian ethnic linguistic identity, and the idea to treat all the entire Slavic community, right, as under one identity of Russian language and Russian ethnicity is something that you can see today in Kremlin's push under Vladimir Putin, right? A clear attempt to try and revive that glory of the Soviet era. See, under Putin, Russia has even established a economic grouping called the Eurasian Economic Union. So Russia today has managed to bring together few of its closest partners like Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Armenia, then even Kyrgyzstan, and it wants to expand this further. But when it was established in 2014, Russia was very keen on including Ukraine under the Eurasian Economic Union. So when Ukraine refused to join the economic bloc, and when Ukraine saw massive anti-Russian protests and the emergence of an anti-Russian government, which was aligned with uh, European and pro-democratic forces, that was seen as a final straw. Right, when Ukraine rejected the membership of this bloc, that's what pushed Russia to attack Ukraine and capture the Crimean Peninsula. That's what led Russia to destabilize the eastern part of Ukraine in the Donbas region, sponsoring the pro-Russian separatists. Eventually, all these developments led to the 2022 invasion, where Russia has invaded Ukraine and the war continues to drag. So, in a way, to understand current geopolitics, when you look back, right, when you look at the origin of the Cold War, the post Second World War events, when you analyze the fall of the Soviet Union and the post 91 developments that occurred, it basically gives you a better grasp of what's happening today. And I think that is where this particular topic, this chapter in the NCERT class 12, holds a very important lesson for international relations. Now, as I said, one important assessment here is that most experts back then in 80s and 90s, they were initially predicting that the rebellion and the idea to break apart from Soviet Union would be more stronger in Central Asian republics, because this is where people were ethnically, religiously more different. These regions were more backward. There was more suffering towards Central Asia region. But surprisingly, this is not where the revolt was centered. This is where the actual republics under authoritarian leaders, they were aligned with Kremlin. They wanted to be part of Soviet Union, right? Even when things were falling apart, Central Asia until 1991, they never wanted independence. They wanted to be part of USSR. They were happy to be a part of USSR. But it's primarily the more progressive and the forward-looking regions like Ukraine, Georgia, and the others, which had more European exposure, which had seen European standard of living or American cultural influence, which was evident on them, the American political economic influence, which was evident in these parts of Europe. Those are the regions which actually broke apart, right? They were the ones who first led the dismantling of the entire centralized setup. So this again shows how regions which are actually performing well, regions which are growing, regions which are contributing to national economy, when their genuine aspirations are not met, when attempts are made to crush the opinions, right? When space is not given for the local sentiments to be expressed and reforms are not initiated on time, that could become the main trigger, which could build upon the resentment and lead to the eventual fall of even the most powerful political economic systems. So I think that is a key lesson that you should take away from the collapse of the USSR, right? So this brings my discussion to an end for today. We have covered the brief history of the Cold War, the sequence of events that led to the Cold War rivalries and divisions. We even spoke about the factors, right? The 4 or 5 different factors, political, economic, and external factors that led to the disintegration and collapse of the USSR. Tomorrow, we'll continue the discussion. In that session, we'll discuss more about the consequences of the collapse of USSR, how it affected the region, the Eurasia region, how it affected the rest of the world. Because from a bipolar world, we entered a unipolar world, right? Because Russia as a successor state would never be a match to the American dominance. Post 91, US clearly exerted its global dominance, emerged as a leading economic military powerhouse, right? And the Western countries, through European Union, through NATO, started exercising their dominant influence. We even saw the emergence of alternate power centers. We saw the rise of Asian economies led by China, Southeast Asian economies, then the rise of India as well. How it altered the global geopolitical landscape. That is something we'll discuss tomorrow. We'll also talk about how India navigated this period because 1991 represented a big shock for India. India lost a trusted partner. The USSR was an all-weather friend. It had stood with us during the Kashmir crisis, right? When Pakistan had meddled with the Kashmir issue. At the United Nations, India had one friend, that was the USSR. During liberation of Goa, when India had to fight against Portugal, right? When India was being criticized and pressurized by European powers and United States, it was only the USSR which stood with India. With regard to our nuclear and space program, when US was actually actively trying to subvert our program, target our program through sanctions or through various international collective efforts, USSR stood with India and continued to back our nuclear and space program. Even when India tested the nuclear weapons in 74 and later in 98, the Soviet Union understood India's requirement, the strategic requirement of India. So when USSR collapsed in 91, we lost a trusted partner. We lost a guiding light. We lost an all-weather friend. So it was a difficult time for Indian foreign policy where we had to find new partners who could align with India. We were internally facing an economic crisis as well, the BOP crisis, the balance of payments crisis, where India initiated the LPG reforms, right? Focused on liberalization, privatization, globalization. Because the socialist experiment in India also had failed. Though socialist model served well initially, the planned model had worked well in the 50s and 60s, especially to build our large industries, to focus on our green revolution and agriculture. Eventually, the failure was evident. The red tapeism, the corruption, the license and inspector Raj era of the 80s had dragged the Indian economy down. And the BOP crisis pushed India towards massive economic reforms, the LPG reforms. So the need had arisen for India to find new markets, to find new investments, to find a new diplomatic partner who could stand with India at the global level, right? Because Russia would not be the same as the USSR. And this opened up a new chapter in Indian foreign policy. And that is what we'll study in the next class. So please don't miss the next session. Let me know how this session went. Any doubts, any questions, please post that in the comments. Now also try to answer this question. What is your take on the collapse of Soviet Union? Did Soviet Union collapse because of its own internal inconsistencies with the communist socialist model? Or was it the role of United States and its active destabilization of the communist regime? What do you think contributed more? That's what I want to know from your side. Was it the American covert interference or was it the internal inconsistencies of the Soviet Union? Please let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Please don't miss tomorrow's session again at the same time at 7 p.m. Thank you. Good night.